Chapter 1. The Encounter with the Book. Lucas was accustomed to wandering aimlessly through the streets of his city. He enjoyed exploring old shops and flea markets, where the scent of used books and dusty trinkets made him feel at home. But that day was different. A small shop, almost hidden between larger and more inviting establishments, caught his attention. The display window, filled with curious items, seemed to shimmer in an unusual way, drawing his gaze. As he stepped inside, he was immediately enveloped by the air of mystery that hung in the room. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with an enigmatic look in his eyes, watched Lucas from a distance. Lucas strolled slowly through the narrow aisles, running his fingers over the objects, until his eyes landed on a book. It was large, bound in aged leather, and carried an aura of antiquity that made it seem more valuable than anything else in the shop. The title, inscribed subtly and almost hidden, read, "The Magical Book of Time." Intrigued, Lucas picked up the book and opened it. The sensation of touching it was different, almost electric, as though something had begun to connect with him. The shopkeeper, noticing the young man's interest, approached and spoke in a hushed tone. "This book chooses its owner, young man. It knows who it should guide." Lucas, startled by the statement, smiled nervously and replied, "Sounds like one of those old legends, doesn't it?" The shopkeeper did not smile back, but locked his gaze onto Lucas's eyes, as if peering into his soul. "This book is not just a story," he said. "It's a portal." Not fully understanding the shopkeeper's words, but unable to resist his growing curiosity, Lucas purchased the book and left the shop without looking back. As soon as he got home, he settled into his favorite chair and began leafing through the pages of the magical book of time. The words seemed to write themselves as he read, and he was quickly absorbed into a story that transported him to another place, to another time. It was a tale of a knight in a distant land, facing dragons and monsters in a medieval world. Lucas read eagerly, soaking up every detail. But as he delved deeper into the pages, something extraordinary happened. A chill ran down his spine, as though he were inside the story, living the knight's adventures. The sound of wind and the roar of the dragon felt real. Suddenly, he found himself in the midst of the battle, holding a sword, with a colossal dragon looming before him. He could feel the heat of the dragon's flames, the fear, and the tension of the fight. The knight in the book was using his strength and wits to overcome the creature, and somehow Lucas instinctively knew what to do. He moved like the knight, dodging the dragon's fiery breath and delivering a precise blow. The creature fell, defeated. As the victory unfolded, the scene dissolved, and Lucas woke up, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. He was back in his bed, but the feeling of having been somewhere else was undeniable. Looking at his arm, he saw a scratch exactly where the knight had been wounded. It was just a dream, he thought, trying to convince himself, but deep down he knew it wasn't. The book sat closed on the table next to his bed, but a strange sensation began to creep into Lucas's mind. What he had read didn't feel like just a story. He sensed that something far greater was at play, something he didn't yet understand. What else could the book reveal? What had he just experienced? Lucas knew there was magic in that book, something calling him to a much larger adventure. Chapter 2. The First Reading. Lucas had barely slept after the unsettling experience of the previous night. The scratch on his arm, an inexplicable remnant of what should have been just a dream, intrigued him. Morning light streamed through his curtains, but his thoughts were fixated on the book sitting on his desk. He hesitated for a moment, but curiosity won out. Pulling the book closer, he opened it to the first page. This time, the story seemed clearer. It was as though the text had rearranged itself to make reading easier. The narrative began with a description of a vast battlefield, where a knight in shining armor faced a powerful enemy, a fire-breathing dragon that destroyed everything in its path. Lucas read intently, feeling increasingly drawn into the tale. As he reached the part where the knight unsheathed his sword, the atmosphere around him changed. A cold wind blew through the room, and the sound of the pages turning in the book echoed unnaturally. Lucas blinked in confusion, and then realized he was no longer in his room. He was on the battlefield described in the story. In front of him, the dragon roared, its scales reflecting sunlight like a bronze mirror. Lucas looked down and saw he was no longer wearing his usual clothes. Instead, he was clad in heavy armor and holding a long sword. The heat of the scene was real, as was the acrid smell of smoke in the air. Fear gripped him, but before he could think about running, the dragon lunged. Lucas moved instinctively. It was as if his body knew what to do, guided by an invisible force. He dodged the attack, swung the sword, and prepared for the next move. Flames passed dangerously close, heating the air around him, but he stood firm. The battle seemed to last an eternity, and every strike demanded more effort than he thought he could muster. Finally, Lucas found an opening. With a cry of determination, he struck the dragon with all his might. The blade hit its mark, and the creature's final roar echoed across the skies before it collapsed to the ground, defeated. The sense of victory was overwhelming, but before he could celebrate, everything around him began to fade. He woke up in his bed again, gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. The images of the battlefield were still fresh in his mind. Lucas looked at the book, now closed beside his bed. It was impossible to ignore the evidence. The scratch on his arm was deeper now, a physical reminder of the adventure. "This can't be real." "Can it?" he murmured to himself. But something inside him told him it was, that the book was no ordinary object. Once again, curiosity began to grow. Lucas realized that his life would never be the same. Chapter 3. The Impact of the First Adventure. The sun was already high when Lucas woke up for the second time that morning. The heat of the battlefield still seemed to cling to his skin, and his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He rubbed his eyes, trying to discern whether what had happened was just an incredibly vivid dream. But the scratch on his arm, now with a slight crust of dried blood, was impossible to ignore. Still confused, Lucas picked up the book again. He opened it, expecting to find the words of the story he had lived, but the pages were blank. He turned one page after another, but all remained empty, as if the book were waiting for something. Frustrated, he slammed it shut and left it on the table. As he walked to the kitchen to grab something to eat, images of the dragon and the battle kept flashing in his mind. He could feel the weight of the armor, the strength of the sword in his hand, and even the intense heat of the dragon's flames. Everything felt so real. He wondered if he was losing his mind. In the kitchen, his mother observed him with a concerned expression. "You look tired. Did you sleep well?" she asked, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "Yeah, more or less," Lucas replied, avoiding her gaze. How could he explain something he didn't even understand himself? After breakfast, Lucas decided to leave the house to clear his mind. He walked through the neighborhood, trying to shake off the feeling that something was different. The people around him seemed normal, but he couldn't help but feel that he himself had changed. It was as if the battle he had lived through had left an invisible mark beyond the scratch on his arm. As he walked, he noticed an antique shop on the corner. The window displayed old books, musical instruments, and peculiar objects. Something made him stop. Perhaps it was the desire to find answers, or just the need to confirm that the world was still following its normal course. He went inside. The smell of old wood and dust was comforting. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with thick glasses, greeted him with a nod. Lucas looked around, searching for something that could connect to his experience. His eyes stopped on a gold-framed mirror, and he felt a chill. For a moment he thought his reflection was wearing the knight's armor, but when he blinked, everything seemed normal again. Looking for something specific, the shopkeeper asked, interrupting his thoughts. "No, just curious," Lucas replied, trying to hide his unease. He left the shop without buying anything, but the feeling that the book was more than it seemed continued to haunt him. When he returned home, the book was still on the table, as if it had been waiting for him. He sat down in front of it, hesitating. If it were true, if he had really lived that battle, what else could happen? And if the book was dangerous? But another question consumed him even more. What would happen if he decided never to read it again? Lucas knew he was facing a choice that could change his life forever. Curiosity and fear were waging a battle within him, but something told him he wouldn't be able to resist for long. Chapter 4. The book reveals itself. At the end of a long and introspective day, Lucas sat at the table again, staring at the book with a mix of fascination and apprehension. He hesitated for a few moments, but something inside him urged him to open it again. The pages seemed to call to him, as if the object itself were alive. Finally, he gave in. When he opened the book, he noticed that new words had appeared. This time, it wasn't the story of a knight facing dragons. It was an entirely different scene, a village surrounded by dense forests, with frightened villagers whispering about a dark threat lurking in the trees, something no one dared to confront. Lucas's heart raced. He felt the familiar dizziness from before, as though he were being pulled into the pages. This time he was more aware of the process. The environment around him faded, replaced by the village described in the story. When he opened his eyes, Lucas found himself standing in the center of a cobblestone square. The villagers gazed at him with awe and hope. "It's him," murmured an elderly woman, pointing at the sword on his belt. Lucas realized he was once again wearing the garb of a hero, complete with a cloak and light armor. "You've come to save us," said a man with a weary expression. He explained that the village had been terrorized by a mysterious creature from the forest, and that everyone believed Lucas was the answer to their prayers. This time, Lucas didn't hesitate as much. He realized he wasn't just experiencing the stories. He had an important role to play. Grabbing his sword, he ventured into the forest, following the clues left by the villagers. The surroundings were eerie, with trees so tall they blocked out the sunlight. Strange sounds echoed around him, and Lucas had to constantly remind himself that he was inside a story. But everything felt so real. The smell of wood, the damp cold biting his skin, the weight of the sword in his hand. After hours of walking, he encountered the creature. It was an imposing shadow with glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce his soul. Lucas felt fear rising, but also a determination he had never experienced before. The battle was intense. The creature was fast and seemed to anticipate his moves, but Lucas used his wits to turn the tide. He noticed that light weakened the monster and managed to lure it into a moonlit clearing. With a final strike, he defeated the shadow, which dissolved into the air like smoke. When he returned to the village, he was met with celebration. The villagers hugged him and showered him with praise, but before he could grow accustomed to the joy, Lucas felt the same dizziness as before. In the blink of an eye, he was back at his table at home. The book was closed, as if nothing had happened. However, in his hand, Lucas held a black feather, the only physical proof of the creature he had defeated. It was further confirmation that this wasn't a dream. He took a deep breath, trying to process what had just happened. The book was far more than it seemed, and Lucas knew he was only beginning to uncover its mysteries.